with respect to the probability of the resurrection relative to our background information, I argued that we have no way of knowing how to determine this. Greg says either we use relative frequencies to assess the probability, or else you use natural laws. But relative frequencies is not going to work at all when you deal with unique historical events. In that basis, any unique historical event comes out to be improbable because it is unique. You can't use a relative frequency approach to deal with unique events in history. Secondly, natural laws such as thermodynamics are simply irrelevant, because the contention is not that Jesus somehow spontaneously came back to life naturally, but rather that God raised Jesus from the dead. And I admit that that's scientifically and thermodynamically impossible or wildly improbable. So that's not the relevant notion of probability. Greg then admits that outside of this, we have no way of determining the probabilities of what God would do. And that is exactly my point. Because we cannot determine that probability with any degree of accuracy, we cannot use Bayes' theorem in assessing the probability of the resurrection of Jesus. And it's the best explanation of the evidence. And I looked at 6 tests, all of which the resurrection passes. Greg only chose to attack the third of those tests, that the resurrection is more plausible. He said, well, what is plausibility? After all, McCullough's notion is incoherent. Well, I think we have a rather rough and ready idea of plausibility. We mean the compatibility of one's hypothesis with the background information that's available. And you remember when I looked at the twin theory, I showed how implausible it was, given the facts of the birth of Jesus, there being no concept of a dying and rising Messiah, the way tombs were sealed in Palestine. There's nothing like that to show that the resurrection is implausible relative to the background information. And I said, particularly when you consider the context in which these events occurred, the radical self-understanding and claims of Jesus of Nazareth. Greg here made the puzzling remark that it's question-begging to appeal to Jesus' radical claims. Well, I frankly don't understand this at all. It is an established part of New Testament scholarship that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand in God's place and to speak as the voice of God on matters that belong properly only to God. And any historical reconstruction of Jesus of Nazareth has to take those facts into account. And I submit that when you consider that religio-historical context, the resurrection of Jesus makes good sense in that context. It is God's vindication of these claims for which Jesus was crucified on the charge of blasphemy. Greg didn't dispute the other tests that McCullough offered, so even if we threw out one of them, we still have the other 5, and I think that these provide ample justification for accepting the resurrection theory. Finally, number 3,
I do have to tack on that Paul had a hallucination. But notice, the resurrection theory cannot explain Paul's appearance on the road to Damascus by itself either. It has to assume that Jesus ascended into heaven. It then has to assume that Jesus had some kind of miraculous power of calling light and sound down from heaven. So if you talk about an ad hoc extra hypothesis, not only are we required on the resurrection theory to say that Jesus became alive again, but we are required to postulate that his body had these utterly fantastic properties, such as the ability to appear and disappear, to go into heaven in ascension, and to call light down from heaven. Now, of course, if you assume a priori that God raised Jesus from the dead, that's no problem. But of course, that begs the question. We need independent evidence for that. Dr. Craig has not given us independent evidence. He seems confused about the claims of Jesus and the resurrection and which comes logically prior. But sometimes he seems to argue the claims of Jesus makes the resurrection more likely. Then he turns around and seems to think that the resurrection is a vindication of the claims of Jesus. Well, you can't have it both ways. Regardless of that, though, as I said, scholars are sharply divided about the claims of Jesus. Most scholars would say he did not claim to be the Messiah. There is great disagreement about whether Jesus considered himself to be a vicarious atonement for the sins of mankind, and there there is great controversy about whether Jesus considered himself to be the Son of Man. Dr. Craig cannot appeal to these claims as though scholars have accepted them. He must argue for them. He has not. All I'm saying is they are not evidence. I don't have to account for those. As far as the numinous character of the resurrection appearances, let me see. Let me go back to McCulloch for a minute. I don't have time to explain this in detail, but I think if we look at McCulloch's concept of plausibility, his concept of explanatory power, he has an incremental degrees notion here. As I said before, he seems to have something like the idea of Rudolf Carnap of partial entailment. Well, that just is a probability notion. It seems to me he uses the idea of degrees of plausibility as a substitute notion for degrees of probability. In fact, he seems to have in mind what we would call epistemic probability. So I do not think that Dr. Craig has extricated himself from the concept of probability by appealing to McCulloch's theory of historical explanation.